The Great Lakes were calm in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of calm that did not come from peace but from restraint. From the observation deck overlooking Lake Superior, the water looked like a vast sheet of darkened glass, stretching so far into the horizon that it swallowed the sky itself. No waves rolled toward the shore. No birds skimmed the surface. Even the wind seemed hesitant, as if it feared disturbing something that preferred to remain undisturbed. Ethan Mercer stood with his hands resting on the cold metal railing, breathing in the sharp scent of fresh water and decay. He had lived near the lake his entire life, but this was the first time he had felt watched by it. Not watched from above or from the distant shoreline, but from somewhere far below, where sunlight failed and pressure crushed anything fragile enough to sink. The lake did not shimmer the way water was supposed to. It absorbed light instead, swallowing reflections and returning nothing. He had come here for work, or at least that was what the official paperwork said. The Great Lakes Research Initiative had hired him to assist in mapping unexplored lakebed regions using sonar arrays and deep-water drones. On paper, it was a routine environmental survey. In reality, it was something far more uncomfortable. Too many anomalies had been detected over the past decade, too many readings that made no sense, too many shapes where shapes should not exist. Behind him, the research vessel hummed quietly, its engines idling like a restrained animal. The caldera was not large, but it was heavily modified, reinforced for pressure and silence. Ethan had helped design some of its systems himself, particularly the deep scan sonar capable of penetrating miles of water and sediment. Even so, standing here now, he felt an unease he could not justify with data or logic. Still staring at it like it's going to blink first? The voice came from behind him, low and tired. Dr. Miriam Holt stepped onto the deck, pulling her coat tighter around her thin frame. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had spent too many years uncovering things that should have remained hidden. She had been studying the Great Lakes for over 3 decades, long enough to know that the water remembered everything. "It doesn't feel like water," Ethan said quietly. "It feels held." Miriam followed his gaze, her expression tightening just slightly. "That's what everyone says the first time. Fishermen, sailors, sonar technicians. They all use different words, but the meaning is the same." She paused, then added, "They say it feels like something is waiting." Ethan turned to look at her. "Waiting for what?" "For us," she replied without hesitation. They stood in silence as the lake continued its unnatural stillness. Somewhere far below the surface, pressure crushed ancient rock formations, and water that had not moved in centuries pressed against itself in the dark. Ethan's equipment bag rested at his feet, packed with instruments meant to measure temperature gradients and biological traces. None of it felt sufficient. "You didn't tell me everything in the briefing," he said at last. Miriam sighed, rubbing her temples. "No, I didn't." She motioned for him to follow her inside the vessel. The interior of the caldera was dimly lit, screens glowing with static maps and sonar grids. The hum of machinery filled the space, a constant reminder that they were preparing to disturb something vast and silent. She stopped at a central console and pulled up a classified data file, its access restricted even within the initiative. These readings started appearing about 12 years ago. At first, we thought they were geological, submerged ridges, collapsed caverns, tectonic irregularities, but the shapes began to change. The screen displayed a series of sonar images, each one showing a massive, indistinct form resting along the lakebed. It did not resemble a shipwreck or rock formation. Its edges were too smooth in some places, too jagged in others. Worse, its position shifted subtly between scans. "It moves," Ethan whispered. "Yes," Miriam said, "but not like anything we know. It doesn't swim, it doesn't drift. It repositions itself slowly over months and years, always deeper, always farther from human access." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "And the biological readings?" She hesitated before answering. "Inconclusive. No known DNA markers, no thermal output that makes sense for a living organism. And yet, Ethan said, finishing the thought. It reacts. Miriam nodded. Every time sonar pings intensify, it changes shape. When submarines approach, pressure readings spike around it, as if the water itself is compressing in response. And when vessels linger too long... She clicked to another file. This one showed a list of missing ships, fishing boats, cargo vessels, research crafts. The disappearances spanned decades, some dating back nearly a century. Each one shared the same final coordinates, directly above the anomaly. These waters are deep, Miriam said softly, but not deep enough to lose this many vessels without debris. No wreckage, no survivors, just empty water. Ethan swallowed. He had studied the Great Lakes his entire career, memorizing their depths, currents, and myths. He knew the stories, of course. Every coastal town had them. Tales of lights beneath the waves, of voices carried across foggy nights, of shapes glimpsed beneath clear ice in winter. He had dismissed them as folklore, a way for people to make sense of the unknown. Now, standing aboard a vessel equipped to peel back the darkness, he realized how thin the line between myth and measurement truly was. "When do we deploy?" he asked. Miriam glanced at the console mounted above the console. "At dusk." Ethan frowned. "Why wait?" "Because," she said low, her voice lowering, "it becomes more active when the light fades." As if summoned by her words, a low-frequency alarm pulsed through the ship. One of the sonar technicians called out from the rear station, his voice strained. "Dr. Holt, we're getting movement." Miriam and Ethan rushed to the display. The anomaly had shifted again, its outline blurring and expanding, as if something massive was unfolding in the dark. The surrounding water registered sudden pressure changes, rippling outward in slow, deliberate waves. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. It knows we're here. Miriam did not deny it. She simply stared at the screen, her reflection pale against the glow. "It's always known, Ethan. The Great Lakes are not empty. They are not asleep." Outside, the surface of Superior remained perfectly still, betraying nothing of what stirred miles beneath. No ripples marked the movement, no sound carried across the water. But far below, something ancient adjusted itself in the dark, responding to the presence of those who dared to look for it. And for the first time since humanity had named these waters, the thing beneath the Great Lakes prepared to be seen. By the time dusk settled over Lake Superior, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. Low clouds pressed down on the horizon, blurring the line between air and water until the world felt compressed, as though the lake itself were closing in. The caldera drifted farther from shore, its engines muted, guided more by instrumentation than sight. Lights along the deck flickered on, casting pale reflections that vanished almost immediately into the black water. Ethan sat at the primary sonar station, headphones pressed over his ears, listening to the steady rhythm of pings returning from the depths. Each echo carried a slight delay, a reminder of just how deep the lake truly was. Lake Superior was not supposed to feel like an ocean, but tonight it did. Vast, heavy, and indifferent. "Depth holding at 900 meters, one of the technicians reported. No surface traffic within range." Miriam stood behind Ethan, arms folded, her gaze fixed on the central display. The anomaly pulsed faintly on the screen, its boundaries shifting in a slow, organic rhythm. It no longer resembled a static shape. It looked aware. "Begin passive scan. No active sonar yet." Ethan complied, switching systems. Passive scanning relied on listening rather than probing, capturing vibrations and movements already present in the water. The lake responded with its usual low murmur, currents brushing against stone, distant geological creaks. But beneath it all, there was another sound. A deep, irregular resonance, so low it was almost felt rather than heard. "Are you getting that?" Ethan asked. Miriam nodded slowly. "Yes." The resonance did not match any known seismic pattern. It rose and fell with a deliberate cadence, like a breath drawn over minutes instead of seconds. Ethan adjusted the filters, isolating the frequency. The sound sharpened, becoming unmistakable in its intent. "It's not random," he said. "It's repeating." The realization made the air inside the caldera feel thinner. If the sound was a pattern, then it was communication, or at least function. Living systems repeated behaviors. Machines did too, but this was neither mechanical nor geological. It was something in between. "Launch Drone 1, Miriam ordered quietly. A small crew member hesitated. "Dr. Holt, if it reacts." "I know," she replied. "Launch it anyway." The deployment bay opened beneath the vessel, releasing a sleek, unmanned drone into the water. Its lights remained off, relying on low-light sensors as it descended. On the monitor, the drone's camera feed showed murky darkness, flecks of organic debris drifting past like underwater snow. As it sank deeper, the pressure readings climbed steadily. Ethan monitored the drone's telemetry, his fingers tense on the controls. The resonance grew louder, filling his headphones until it vibrated against his skull. "Depth holding at 1,200 meters, the technician said, approaching the anomaly's upper boundary. The camera feed flickered. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but black. Then, faintly, the darkness seemed to shift, not move exactly, but rearrange itself, like shadows bending around an unseen mass. "Enhance contrast," Miriam said. Ethan adjusted the settings. The image sharpened, revealing a vast expanse of textured surface below the drone. It was not rock, it was too smooth, too patterned. Ridges and grooves ran along it in long, sweeping arcs like the striations on the underside of a colossal shell. "Oh my God," someone whispered. The drone continued its descent, revealing more of the structure. It sprawled across the lakebed, immense beyond comprehension. Portions of it disappeared into sediment as if it had grown into the earth itself. Other sections rose slightly, forming hollowed cavities where darkness pooled unnaturally. "Is that tissue?" Ethan asked, his voice barely steady. Miriam did not answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, pupils dilated. "We don't know," she said finally, "but if it is, it's unlike anything on this planet." The resonance intensified. The drone's sensors began to spike, pressure fluctuating erratically despite the depth remaining constant. It was as if the water itself were being compressed and released in waves. "Drone integrity dropping," the technician warned. "Hull stress increasing." "Hold position," Miriam said. "I want a full scan." Ethan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to pull the drone back. The image on the screen was wrong in a way he could not articulate. The surface below seemed to ripple subtly, responding to the drone's presence. Then something moved. At the edge of the camera's range, a shadow slid across the frame. It was not the slow drift of sediment or the sway of plant life. It moved with intent, gliding along the massive structure before vanishing into one of the dark cavities. "Did you see that?" Ethan said. Before anyone could respond, the resonance shifted. The low rhythm broke into sharper pulses, each one sending a shudder through the drone's frame. The camera feed shook violently, static tearing across the image. "Pressure spike," the technician shouted. "We're exceeding tolerance." "Pull it back," Ethan said, overriding Miriam's order. The drone's thrusters engaged, straining against the crushing force. The camera feed briefly stabilized, giving one final horrifying glimpse of the structure below. A section of the surface peeled back, not mechanically but organically. Layers separated, revealing a darker interior that glistened faintly as though lined with wet, living material. From within, something vast and indistinct shifted, displacing water in a slow, powerful surge. The feed went black. "Drone 1 is offline," the technician said, his voice shaking. Silence filled the control room. The resonance faded, retreating back into the depths until only the ambient sounds of the lake remained. On the sonar display, the anomaly's outline contracted, settling deeper into the lakebed as if satisfied. Ethan removed his headphones, his hands trembling. "It reacted," he said, not defensively, curiously. Miriam exhaled slowly. "Yes, and now it knows we can reach it." She turned to face the crew, her expression grim. "No more passive observation. We've crossed a threshold." Outside, the surface of Lake Superior remained deceptively calm, the darkening sky reflected faintly in its glassy expanse. But far below, where no light reached and pressure ruled, something ancient had felt the touch of human curiosity, and it had answered. Night settled fully over Lake Superior, swallowing the last trace of color from the sky. The caldera floated in near total darkness, its navigation lights the only indication of human presence on the vast black surface. The loss of Drone 1 hung over the crew like a held breath. No one spoke unless necessary, as if sound itself might carry downward and draw attention once more. Ethan sat alone at the auxiliary console, replaying the final seconds of the drone's feed. He had slowed the footage frame by frame, magnifying every flicker of static, every distortion. What unsettled him most was not the immense scale of what they had seen, but the way it had responded. There had been no panic, no sudden aggression, only adjustment, as though a sleeping thing had rolled over after feeling an irritation against its skin. A soft chime broke the silence. A new data packet had finished processing. "Miriam," Ethan said quietly, "you need to see this." She approached, her footsteps measured. "What did you find?" Ethan pulled up a composite overlay, combining sonar, pressure readings, and the drone's last visual data. The resonance pattern. I mapped it against historical data, seismic records, acoustic anomalies, even old shipping logs. The screen filled with timelines stretching back decades. Peaks appeared at irregular intervals, some barely noticeable, others pronounced. "It's not new," Ethan continued. "The pattern's been repeating for at least 100 years. Every time there's increased human activity on the lakes, the resonance intensifies." Miriam's jaw tightened. Wars, industrial expansion, shipping booms. "Yes," Ethan said, "and something else." He highlighted a series of smaller spikes. Disappearances, shipwrecks with no wreckage, entire crews gone without distress calls. Miriam stared at the data, her reflection pale and fragmented in the glass. "You're saying it's responding to us?" "I'm saying it always has." The caldera creaked softly as a subtle swell passed beneath it, though the surface remained calm. Ethan glanced instinctively toward the hull stress monitors. All readings were nominal, but the unease lingered. "Ethan," Miriam said, lowering her voice, "there are stories." He looked at her, surprised. "Stories?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Indigenous accounts, long before the lakes were mapped or named as we know them. I didn't include them in the official briefings. Too many people would dismiss them." "What do they say?" Miriam folded her arms, as though warding off a chill. "They speak of a presence beneath the water, not a beast, not a god, but a keeper, something that remembers everything that enters its domain. They believed the lakes were alive, and that what lived beneath them was older than the land itself." Ethan considered the footage again, the layered surface, the cavities, the slow, deliberate movement. A biological memory, an organism so vast it functions as an archive. "Or a consciousness," Miriam replied. Before Ethan could respond, a technician called out from the communication station. "Dr. Holt, we're receiving a signal." Miriam moved quickly. "From where?" The technician swallowed. "From below." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "That's impossible. We're not transmitting." The signal appeared as a series of low-frequency oscillations, similar to the resonance they had recorded earlier, but structured differently. This was not a passive echo. It was directed. "It's using pressure waves," Ethan analyzed the data, "like sonar, but shaped." The oscillations began to modulate, forming a pattern that caused the air inside the vessel to vibrate faintly. Loose objects rattled against metal surfaces. "It's communicating," someone whispered. Miriam closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "Translate it." Ethan worked quickly, feeding the signal into his software, mapping the oscillations against known linguistic and mathematical patterns. The process was crude, speculative, but the results made his breath catch. "It's not language," he said slowly. "It's memory." The screen filled with images reconstructed from data interference. Shapes formed, indistinct but recognizable. Wooden ships with tall masts, iron freighters cutting through fog, small fishing boats swallowed by sudden storms. Then the images changed. A shoreline settlement, long abandoned, figures standing at the water's edge, watching as something vast shifted beneath the surface. Fires burned along the shore, reflected in the dark water. Fear radiated from the scene, heavy and palpable. Ethan pulled off his headphones. "It's showing us what it remembers."
"And why?" Miriam asked. The signal intensified. New images formed, sharper now. Modern vessels, research ships. The caldera itself rendered as a distorted silhouette from below, its lights glaring like intrusive stars. "It knows us," Ethan said. "It recognizes us." A sudden alarm blared. Hull pressure spiked, not enough to cause damage, but enough to send a shudder through the ship. The lake around them remained eerily calm, the disturbance contained entirely beneath the surface. "It's coming closer," the technician said, panic creeping into his voice. "The anomaly's rising." Miriam steadied herself against a console. "Depth? Still miles below, but it's not staying in place." Ethan stared at the sonar display as the massive outline shifted upward by a fraction that still represented hundreds of meters. "It doesn't need to surface, it just needs to reach." The signal changed again. One final image formed on the screen. A dark shape beneath ice, massive and patient. Above it, tiny human figures moved, unaware, their reflections trembling on the frozen surface. Then the signal ceased. Silence returned to the caldera, heavier than before. The anomaly settled once more, but not as deep as it had been. It lingered closer to them, closer to the human world than at any point in recorded history. Miriam exhaled shakily. "It's warning us." Ethan nodded slowly. "Or reminding us." Outside, Lake Superior gave no sign of the exchange that had taken place. The surface remained smooth and black, reflecting the stars like indifferent eyes. But beneath, the keeper of the depths had stirred, sharing fragments of its endless memory. And in doing so, it had made one thing clear. The Great Lakes did not forget, and they did not forgive.
Sleep became impossible aboard the caldera. The crew moved through the vessel with the hushed urgency of people afraid that even their thoughts might be overheard. Every system was monitored, every sensor watched, yet no one trusted the data anymore. The lake had spoken once, and now its silence felt deliberate, heavy with intent. Ethan had not left the control room in hours. The sonar display glowed softly before him, its familiar grids now a source of dread. The anomaly remained present, its immense outline resting closer to the surface than before. It had not risen much in absolute terms, but the shift was undeniable. Something that had slept in the deepest darkness was slowly closing the distance between itself and the world above. Miriam stood beside him, nursing a cup of untouched coffee. Her hands trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady. "We need to decide what this expedition is," she said, "because whatever we thought we were doing when we came out here, it's no longer true." Ethan nodded. "We're not observers anymore." "No," she agreed. "We're participants." A soft chime interrupted them. One of the junior technicians looked up from her station, her face pale. "Dr. Holt, we're receiving pressure variations again. Wide area this time." Ethan leaned forward, scanning the data. The lakebed readings showed subtle but widespread fluctuations, as if the water itself were shifting around a massive displacement. It was not localized to the anomaly anymore. The pressure waves extended outward for miles. "It's moving water," Ethan said quietly. "Not just around itself, around us." Miriam's expression hardened. "It's asserting presence." As if to confirm her words, the caldera rocked gently. Not a wave, not a swell, but a slow, deliberate lift, like a hand testing the weight of an object. Several crew members grabbed for support as loose equipment rattled and slid. "Engines to full stabilization," Miriam ordered. The engines responded, compensating for the movement, but the lake did not settle. The surface outside remained deceptively smooth, the disturbance occurring entirely below. Ethan felt a pressure in his ears, a deep ache behind his eyes, as though the water were pressing inward through the hull. Then the resonance returned. This time it was stronger, more complex. The sound filled the ship, vibrating through metal and bone alike. It was no longer a distant murmur, it was close enough to feel personal. Ethan closed his eyes, bracing himself as fragments of imagery flooded his thoughts.
This was not transmitted through screens or speakers. It was as if the lake itself were pressing memory directly into him. He saw the lakes as they once were, long before names, before borders. Vast inland seas carved by ice, untouched and endless. He felt the slow passage of centuries, the rise and fall of forests, the migration of animals along ancient shorelines. Beneath it all, a presence remained, constant and patient, growing not outward, but inward, accumulating memory layer by layer. "It's showing me everything," Ethan whispered. Miriam turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "I think," he said, struggling to focus, "the lake doesn't experience time the way we do. It doesn't forget because it can't. Everything that enters the lakes becomes part of it. Every ship, every body, every sound." The ship shuddered again, stronger this time. Alarms flared across the control panels as hull stress readings climbed into yellow, not critical yet, but approaching. "Dr. Holt," a technician said, panic creeping into his voice. "The anomaly's rising faster now." Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the sonar. The massive outline was no longer static. It was unfolding, extending upward in vast, slow motions. Portions of it detached from the lakebed, lifting free of the sediment as though awakening from a long confinement. "It's coming," someone said. Miriam steadied herself, gripping the edge of the console. "No," she said quietly, "it's listening." The resonance shifted again, forming a new pattern. This one felt focused, narrowed, as though the presence beneath the lake were directing its attention specifically at the caldera. The pressure inside the ship increased, lights flickering as systems struggled to compensate. Ethan felt a sudden clarity cut through his fear. "It doesn't see us as threats," Ethan said. "It sees us as noise." Miriam looked at him sharply. "Explain." "We're loud," Ethan said. "Sonar, engines, drilling, shipping lanes. We filled its environment with interference. This isn't an attack, it's a correction." As if to confirm her words, the resonance deepened, sending a wave through the water that slammed into the caldera with bone-rattling force. Crew members were thrown to the floor. One of the overhead panels burst open, showering sparks across the room. "Hull breach imminent," someone shouted. Miriam shouted orders, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Emergency ascent, now." The engines roared, straining as the caldera began to ascend. The lake resisted, pressure bearing down on the vessel as though reluctant to let it go. Ethan watched the depth gauge climb agonizingly slowly, every meter gained feeling stolen. The resonance followed them, not chasing, but enveloping. The sound pressed in from all sides, vibrating through the hull until Ethan felt sure it would crush them outright. Images flooded his mind again, faster now, more fragmented. Faces staring up through dark water, hands pressed against ice, voices calling out, muffled and distant. "They didn't disappear," Ethan gasped. "They were absorbed." The caldera lurched violently as a massive pressure wave surged beneath it. The anomaly's outline on the sonar expanded upward, its uppermost reaches stretching closer to the surface than ever before. For the first time, something broke the surface of Lake Superior. Not flesh, not a visible form, but a disturbance. The water bulged outward, forming a vast circular swell that rose without waves or foam. The lake seemed to inhale, drawing water inward towards a central point miles beneath the ship. Ethan stumbled towards a viewport, his heart hammering. Outside, the lake no longer reflected the stars. It was dark and matte, swallowing light completely. Miriam joined him, her face ashen. "If it reaches the surface," she said, "the lakes won't survive it." "Neither will we," Ethan replied. The caldera continued its desperate ascent, engines screaming in protest. Behind them, beneath miles of water, the keeper of the depth stirred fully awake, responding not with malice, but with inevitability. The Great Lakes were rising, and humanity was standing directly in their path. The caldera broke the surface just before dawn. The ascent ended not with relief, but with a hollow stillness that settled over the ship like a held breath. The lake around them was wrong.
There were no waves, no wind-swept ripples, only a vast, motionless expanse stretching to every horizon. The water looked thicker somehow, darker than night, as if depth itself had climbed to the surface and spread outward. Ethan collapsed into a chair, lungs burning, hands shaking uncontrollably. Around him, the crew lay scattered, some groaning softly, others staring in stunned silence at the consoles that had gone eerily quiet. Alarms had ceased, readings stabilized. It was as though the lake had decided, abruptly, to stop. Miriam stood near the forward viewport, her back straight, her face unreadable. She did not look relieved. She looked resigned. "It let us go," Ethan said hoarsely. Miriam nodded once. "Yes." "That doesn't make sense," he continued. "If it wanted silence, if it wanted correction, it could have crushed us." "Yes," she said again. "It could have." Ethan followed her gaze out over the water. The surface remained unbroken, but he could feel it now, a pressure not on his body, but on his awareness. The lake felt present in a way it never had before, not hostile, not welcoming, simply attentive. "It didn't release us," he said slowly. "It finished with us." Miriam turned to face him then, and for the first time since the expedition began, there was fear in her eyes. Not panic, but understanding. "It showed us what it keeps," she said, "and now it's done remembering us directly." A faint vibration passed through the hall, subtle enough that the instruments barely registered it. Ethan felt it in his teeth and the base of his skull. The resonance was back, but diminished, distant, retreating. On the sonar display, the anomaly descended. Slowly, deliberately, it folded back into the depths, its immense outline sinking beyond the range of their instruments. With each meter it withdrew, the lake seemed to loosen its grip, as if releasing tension that had built over centuries. The sun crested the horizon, casting a weak gray light across Lake Superior. The water absorbed it without reflection. "We need to report this," a technician said quietly. "The readings, the footage, everything." Miriam did not respond immediately. She stared at the screens, at the empty space where the anomaly had been. When she spoke, her voice was calm but heavy. "No." Ethan looked at her sharply. "What?" "We report the drone loss, equipment failure, inconclusive data. Nothing more." "That's not your call," Ethan said. "This changes everything." "This ends everything," Miriam replied. "If this reaches the wrong people, they won't listen. They'll probe, drill, weaponize. They'll make more noise." She stepped closer, lowering her voice, "and it will answer again." Ethan thought of the images burned into his mind. The absorbed ships, the bodies beneath the ice, the vast archive of memory layered beneath the lakes. He understood then that what lived below was not a predator, but a boundary, a living threshold between human intrusion and something far older. "What happens if we keep pushing?" he asked. Miriam met his gaze. "Eventually, the lake stopped tolerating us." A long silence followed. Outside, the lake remained calm, indifferent to their decision. The caldera turned slowly toward shore, its engines quiet, almost deferential. They docked hours later. Authorities asked questions, reports were filed, explanations were given. The expedition was quietly classified, its data sealed under layers of bureaucracy and denial. Drone 1 was listed as a mechanical failure. The anomaly became a statistical error. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. But Ethan did not forget. Weeks later, standing on the shore of Lake Michigan, he watched the water with new eyes. Families laughed nearby. Boats cut across the surface. The lakes appeared unchanged, timeless and serene. Beneath them, something listened. Ethan felt it now, faint but unmistakable, a presence woven into the water itself. He knew that every drop carried memory, every ripple passed through something vast and aware. The Great Lakes were not merely bodies of water, they were keepers, and they were patient. Far below the surface, where pressure erased light and time folded in on itself, the creature settled once more into stillness. It did not sleep, it remembered. It absorbed the sounds of engines, the echoes of footsteps on docks, the distant hum of cities growing louder each year. It waited, not with hunger, but with certainty. Because the water always keeps what enters it. And one day, when the noise becomes too much, the Great Lakes will rise again. Not in anger, but in remembrance.